Hi guys, welcome back to another video, and today we are going to be talking about range and the formations that you would attack with when you're sending range. So back in the woods today, because it's very hot and it's too hot to do voiceovers in my car because it's like an oven and I will cook alive. So sorry if there's any background noise, it gets a bit windy sometimes. Okay, so range is most people's favourite troop type when it comes to attacking, because range does have the highest walkback rate of the three main troop types, and that's really down to the formations that you send your range in. So when you attack with range, you've got three options for which formation you want to hit in. You've got your infantry phalanx, you've got your infantry wedge, and you've got your cavalry wedge as the third formation. And most people these days tend to gravitate towards cavalry wedge and largely ignore the other two formations, because ideally when you're hitting when you're attacking someone, you want to put your troop type in the back so that they live longer, and that's why people prefer cavalry wedge or even inf phalanx over inf wedge, because inf wedge does put your range in the middle, or rather at the back. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to put each of the three range attack formations to the test. I've got four different simulated compositions which my alt will put out on encampment marches, and we're going to send 2.3k range each time in each of the three different formations to find out which formation does the best compared to the other ones. So the tests will be hitting against a simulated infantry reinforcement trap composition. The second test, hitting against a simulated range trap composition. The third test is just seeing how much damage each your range will take when countered. So hitting a regular composition in an infantry phalanx. And lastly, to see how long your range survives when you get capped. The third and fourth tests are really designed to see how much difference there is putting a range at the back compared to putting a range in the middle in an inf wedge formation. So, as I said, I'm going to be sending 2.3k T4 range with some T1 buffers as well, and I'm going to be sending my leader or my alt in these encampments. And my mixed stats on my alt without talents in monster hunting gear are basically 140 across. So we're going to try and keep everything the same so we get an accurate result. So the first test camp has been laid out now. Of course, I'm going to be changing and refreshing the troops in the camp between each hit to keep everything fair and equal. So I put 1k of each T4 and 4k T2, Cav and range in this camp to simulate an infantry reinforcement comp, which is something that you're very likely to encounter in the game because they're everywhere, and you're also quite likely to be sending range at this comp, or at least if you're sending a double, Cav first and then the range after. So the first hit was an infantry phalanx. I did forget to empty my infirms before the hit, so I took all reds there. But yeah, only around 600 T4 infantry wounded there, and 1074 T4 range killed on my side, and it's a defeat. The next hit will be in inf wedge. Now with inf wedge, if you didn't know, when you've killed half of their inf that they have in the encampment or in their turf or whatever, there will be a retarget, and your range will then begin to engage some of their cavalry squads, which is great because obviously range counts as cavalry, so you'll be doing a lot more damage there. So the second march is a victory, and a quick look at the report. We won by about 120 troops, which is quite a small margin, but considering the last hit was only 600 troops, that's a massive difference between those two hits there, and that is of course because of the retarget. Now the third test will be with Cav Wedge. Now Cav Wedge doesn't have this retargeting thing, so the results will be similar to that of the first test. And also, if you look at the losses between the two hits, you can see that they're not that different, even though with inf phalanx your range is in the back, with inf wedge it's closer to the middle, but the losses there aren't that different. So let's get going with the Cav Wedge test now. So the Cav Wedge hit is another defeat, so that's defeat for Int Phalanx and Cav Wedge. If you look at the report in just a sec, you'll see it like I said, it is pretty similar to the Int Phalanx hit, but here in Cav Wedge, you actually took the least amount of losses compared to Int Phalanx and Int Wedge, and did slightly more damage than Int Phalanx, but it's still a loss because there was none of that vital retargeting that takes place with Int Wedge. So when you're hitting a target with a bit of Inf left and you're sending range, you definitely have to send that in an Inf Wedge to split that Inf in half to get the Cav faster, because you'll do more damage and you won't really take too many more losses. But none of this is really any new information. Most people already knew that range in Inf Wedge halves the infantry and then retargets to their cavalry and therefore does more damage. But what a lot of people don't know is that Inf Wedge has the same effect when hitting range phalanx. So the next test is going to be range marches against a simulated range rain trap composition. So the range rain comp is basically the same as the Inf rain comp I just did. Got 1k of each T4, but this time got 4k T2 Cav and Inf. So let's start off again with Inf Phalanx. Okay, so it's a win there. Now let's look at the report. So we managed to kill 1,900 troops and 1,543 losses for my main ult, and let's see how well that did on the detailed report. So there was a bit of retargeting towards the cavalry at the end, but largely the range just stuck to hitting the range front line and didn't really deviate to the cavalry that much. So next up we've got the Inf Wedge test. Now, like I said earlier, with range marches in Inf Wedge, as soon as half the range is gone, there will be a retarget to hit the cavalry, and also at some point a retarget to hit some of the infantry as well. I've noticed that that often happens when around half of the cavalry is gone, the range will retarget and hit the infantry. The important thing here is that the retarget does happen to the cavalry first, so you will generally do more damage to range phalanx if you're sending in Inf Wedge than you would in Int Phalanx or Cav Wedge. Now, I'm doing these tests in Tashi's kingdom. I did send my ults there to scout for a kingdom before Baron, and if you're watching Tashi's stream, then you know what happens soon after this bit. Tashi comes along and burns my ult. I was recording when that happened, and I'm going to put that in another video because I don't want to detract from the main focus of this video. Yeah, that definitely does happen, and if you're watching Tashi's stream, then you've already seen it. It's quite funny. My ult doesn't get zeroed, but pretty close. Pretty close. So now it's time for the third and final test of this second part, and that's with Cav Wedge. Another thing to note here is that these are just demonstrations and examples of things that might happen when you're attacking with these formations. Obviously, things change, this is difficult to explain. What's happening here in these camp tests might not happen 100% of the time in a real battle scenario, but this kind of gives you an example of stuff that does happen and how the formations work. So with Cav Wedge did the least amount of damage because there wasn't the vital retargeting as there is in Inf Wedge, but the Cav Wedge hit took the least losses as well. So Cav Wedge did do the least damage, but there is an element of usefulness here because Cav Wedge doesn't retarget. So what you can do is, if you're hitting a player in range phalanx and your intention is to clear their range frontline or their cavalry frontline if they're in a Cav phalanx, then you would want to stand in a formation that doesn't retarget like that, because obviously if you keep retargeting after you've taken out half of each tier with the range and then you move on to the cavalry, then you're not going to clear that range frontline as effectively. So if you want to do the most possible damage, you want to send in Inf Wedge, but if you just want to clear that range frontline or Cav, then you would send in Cav Wedge or Int Phalanx. So the third test is going to be sending range marches in each of the three formations against a 1k of each T4 and 4k of each 52 in an int phalanx to see how much damage each formation will do to them getting countered, and how many losses they will take compared to each other. So obviously first, again, we're going to go with int phalanx. 1,807 losses for the attacker, and 1,181 just T2 losses for the defender. So going to move on to int wedge next. Here we would expect int wedge to maybe do some more damage because it's closer to the enemy army, but also take more losses again because it's closer, so that means they'll be engaged by the other troops first. But here we actually see that int wedge takes less losses compared to int phalanx and does more damage as well. If you want to go back and compare the two reports, you can. So our third and final test for this segment is obviously with Cavalry Wedge. Now the results here are kind of weird and not what I expected. Cavalry Wedge actually takes the second most losses out of the T formations, with the least losses going to the int wedge, and it does the second most damage, so that puts it right between int phalanx and int wedge, with int wedge doing the most damage. So now that that segment is concluded, let's move on to the final part of these tests, and that is putting 3 range marches in each of the different formations against a composition that would eat the entire march and would cap the leader. So we're going to time how long each range march lasts in the battle. So the purpose of these tests is to see what the difference in survival time is compared to putting range at the back of the battlefield compared to putting them off in the middle of the battlefield. To discover this, we're going to watch the visual battles back from my alt, and time how long each range march survives. I will be speeding up the visual battles by 2 to make it faster, and also taking out any familiars in either side, because that will make it harder to time the actual length of the battle. One thing to note here is that in each of these 3 hits, my main alt leader will be captured, but it will be automatically released because my secondary ult is shielded, therefore it can't hold prisoners. So that's why on these reports you won't see the leader was captured right in yellow writing at the top of the report, because my ult can't actually cap leaders. But anyway, here is the first battle. Now I use the stopwatch app on my second phone to record the time of the battle. Now unfortunately iMovie does not allow me to edit in a stopwatch next to the battle here, so unfortunately you just have to take my word for it. I'll post the exact times for each of the battles when they're finished. So the exact time from as soon as the troops started walking to the morale hit 0 was 33.53 seconds, so that was infantry phalanx. Now let's move on to int wedge. So the report here, which we'll look at now, shows that again int wedge is doing slightly more damage than int phalanx. But how does int wedge do in the actual battle? Does it last longer? Does it last less? Because it is closer to the middle, so it will be engaged faster than the range in the other formations. Now I want you guys to watch something, because remember, people's logic for sending, range in int phalanx or Cav Wedge is that it puts the range at the back, so it takes longer for those range troops to be engaged by the enemy. When actually, if you look at if you compare the battles between int phalanx and int wedge, which we're watching now, you can see that, actually, when range is put at the back, when the battle starts, the range still has to walk forward a bit before it starts firing. And in int wedge, because the range is already close to the middle, the range doesn't really have to walk much further, if that makes sense. So actually, when the ranged troops are engaged, it doesn't matter what formation they're in, whether it be int phalanx, Cav Wedge, or int wedge, they'll always end up in the same position. So watching the Cav Wedge battle now, the time for the battle in int wedge was 33 seconds, or 33.34, which is almost exactly the same as the int phalanx battle. And as you can see in the Cav Wedge battle, the range stop at basically the same position that they did in int wedge and int phalanx, and then start firing. So it's pretty much the same result for all three formations. They lasted about the same. Cav Wedge did last 1 second longer, but that's probably my error, pressing the button too early or too late. And the times are pretty much identical. That does say a lot. So guys, we've done the 4 tests. What conclusions can we draw from this? Well, the first most obvious one is that it doesn't matter which of those 3 formations you choose to send your range march in, there is zero difference in the survivability because, well, of what I just showed you. Even if you send your range in a formation that puts it all the way at the back, your range still has to walk forward to the middle of the battlefield before it will start firing, and that's where the enemy will engage it. So again, there is practically zero difference in the survivability. Now, second conclusion we can draw is that if you're blind hitting something and you want to do more damage, then you should probably go in an inf wedge, because it will halve the range, it will halve the infantry, and there will be a retarget to the enemy's cavalry. But you don't want to use inf wedge if you are trying to clear a cavalry or a ranged front line. I didn't show any examples here, but I've had solo hits where I've soloed something with range and inf wedge, and they've turned out to be in a cavalry phalanx, and unfortunately their cavalry was halved and retargeted to their infantry, and of course range against infantry isn't going to do that much damage. So that kind of sucked there. I wouldn't have had that effect if I sent in Cav Wedge or in Phalanx. But if you are trying to, like say you're black winging something and you want to kill T4, then you would want to send in a formation that halves through the troop tiers and does that retargeting, so you can move past that T2 and hit their T4 faster and get those nice juicy reds. At the end of the day, the question is, do you know what you're hitting into? And if the answer is yes, well, you've got to see what it is. So if it's if you're going to hit something that is probably in a cavalry phalanx, then you would send in Cav Wedge because you want to kill that cavalry. And even if they were to change to an int phalanx, for example, then that you're probably going to get capped. But in that situation, int wedge isn't really going to help you at all there. And also, if you know that you're going to be hitting range into your range formation, then you would want to send in Cav Wedge to try and clear it. But if, for example, you're hitting a fort, then you should always go an inf wedge, especially if it's a mixed fort, because if they change to infantry phalanx to counter you, then at least you'll only have to go through half of their inf before it retargets. But yeah, when it comes down to it, your choice of which range or which formation you want to send your range in does depend on the situation. In some situations, inf wedge is massively better, but in other situations, you're going to want to send in Cav Wedge. Hope this video was interesting and informative and helped a lot of you out if you like to send range a lot, or if you're a rally leader, or you just like attacking stuff. So thank you guys for watching. Leave your opinions down in the comments, and I'll see you all in the next one.